And we are the Talk Shop. Good morning. The Talk Shop is in Studio 255 at the Laramie Plains Civic Center. This morning's program, February 5th, Thursday, big day in Wyoming. Every day, big day, big opportunities. One such opportunity is the introduction of Jimmy Skovgard, candidate for U.S. Senate in Wyoming, and we appreciate you joining us, Jimmy.
Thanks, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation, and I thank you guys. You know, Laramie's a kind of a hometown for me. I came to Laramie in 1984, and I was here until the mid 90s. You know, we finished the university in 1989, and then started with work with Tri-Hydro Corporation in 93, I believe. And then I think I stayed here until the very early 2000s. So I've been here for a while. I was a kind of a Laramie boy for a while. Kind of grew on me.
What'd you get your degree in?
I have a degree in history. Never thought I would ever use that degree in history. I was thinking to myself after I got that degree, I kind of got that degree because I got a commission in the National Guard, and to get the commission at that time, you had to have a degree. And I was studying physics, and I'm like, I don't think this is going to work out. So I'm like, what's the plan B? And physics and history was there, and I'd always been interested in history, and so I needed an extra year. But I got the history core requirements done and graduated with a bachelor's in 1989. And it was and like I said, I always thought, what am I going to use a degree in history for? And then last year, in actually late 2024, it dawned on me that, there's a reason why people study history. There's a reason why we teach history to our children, and that reason is that so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. I'm sorry.
When you tell people, when you go to a group and you tell them who you are, how do you introduce yourself, Jimmy?
I introduce myself as Jimmy Skovgard, candidate for Senate. If it's a political event, otherwise it's just, hi, I'm Jimmy. How are you?
Yeah. What topics? What are you running on in your campaign? What drove you? What possessed you to seek candidacy and election as U.S. Senator for Wyoming?
What got me off the couch? That's what you're asking. You know what got me off the couch in 2024 was the golden rule. I was thinking to myself, my dad took me to Sunday school when I was a little guy, maybe 7, 8, maybe 10, I don't remember. But we were taught in that basement of the church in Grable, Wyoming, about the love that you show your neighbors, and the I don't know, just do unto others as you'd have done unto you. And I saw that the rhetoric building up to the 2024 campaign, and I thought, I really need to do something here because I know how this is all going to turn out. And I was right. We in Wyoming we got kind of a sense of what's going to happen. And so that got me off the couch. And then as the more I listened, the more I decided that we were a little lacking in integrity, character, and transparency. I thought, maybe we can do something about that too. Anyway, so I started talking, started posting on Facebook, and I got some clickbait from a Democrat funded, or said they were Republican funded. It was Republican voters against Trump. And I'm like, well, that's not going to be very nice for my campaign in Wyoming because 70% of Wyoming supports Trump, which is fine. And anyway, so I got an invitation to go out to the East Coast and hop on a bus and drive through Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And I thought, I'm going to actually be able to go and talk to some rural Republicans in these swing states and maybe make a difference. No, that wasn't the truth. We went from one meeting of Democrats to another meeting of Democrats, and I'm like, I'm here as a show horse. They're using me as a trophy. And I'm like, well, that's what you get for not doing your due diligence. But that's okay. I got to see Washington D.C., Philadelphia, Michigan, and Detroit on somebody else's dime. And
so Jimmy Skovgard, you are running for U.S. Senate on the Republican ticket,
Yes, sir.
and you will then be looking forward. Mark your calendars. August 18th, the primary election, and in May, candidates actually officially file for their campaigns, and you're going to be running against whomever comes to the field. But what do you stand for in your campaign? You talked about transparency. You talked about three important keys. How would you apply those to healthcare in Wyoming?
In Wyoming, I believe that we have an interesting opportunity in front of us. There's been some talk, not a whole lot. I saw an article by a history, he's a historian, a Wyoming historian, and I didn't spend enough time with it. I haven't contacted him yet, but he talks about cowboy care, where the state of Wyoming used to provide health care for the cowboys that worked in the state. And I thought, that sounds intriguing. And so I'm gonna look into that some more, because I think that the state of Wyoming could actually provide a healthcare platform that would work for everybody. It would go something like this. We have a workers' comp insurance program right now where workers contribute, not workers, but employers contribute to a program for their employees through the state of Wyoming. And if something happens, a catastrophic accident happens, then the employer is relieved of responsibility or of liability for the accident, and it's taken on that liability is taken on by the state. And I thought, what if we could expand something like that to cover everybody that has a valid residence in Wyoming, and you back that up with our real ID, which is a good idea also. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor sends his bill to the state rather than to your insurance company. I mentioned that at a town hall once, and of course the conversation shifted over to socialized medicine, and their state's going to tell me who I can use as my doctor. And I looked at it like, the state, who is the state? The realization is that I am the state. When I go, this is a representational democracy that we have here. As citizens, we represent, or we elect our representatives, and they, do the decision making on our behalf, and we should be able to influence that decision making. That's called agency, and when we give up agency, we allow folks to do things that they should not be doing. And then and if they justify it to us, with smoke and mirrors and whatever else they want to use, I find that a bit offensive. I think it's better for us to think about the decisions that we're asking our elected representatives to make for us. It's easy to get upset with them, but I've met and talked with 6 of them so far in Casper. And one thing is very common amongst all of them. They are all extremely busy, and most of them have full-time lives outside of the jobs that they're doing for us. So,
Jimmy, what could be done from the U.S. Senate's perspective to enhance the choices that Wyoming residents have to select their health care plans in Wyoming? Right now, there's very few options.
Exactly, and that's my point. Is I think we're looking at a failed system, Eric. We're looking at something that doesn't work. When insurance companies are pulling out of Wyoming, and the ones that remain are giving us what they call preferred provider lists and formularies that list the drugs that we can use and buy, that to me says failure. There's failure written all over it. And how do we influence that? Well, we don't really have a way to influence that as buyers, as consumers of health insurance. But would we have a way to fix that if it became part of a state program? I think we would. I think we'd have way more say in what we look at as far as healthcare goes. And you know what, Eric? I've done some comparisons on quote unquote socialized medicine. I took a look at what it costs a citizen, you and I, per capita in the United States is $14,700 per person. That's what we're spending on healthcare in the U.S. In Wyoming, it's $10,500 per person in the state of Wyoming. So I was like, well, why don't we take that $10,500 and ship it into a new agency at the state level and let them pay the doctors, the hospitals, the ambulances directly? I'm thinking that we could do it a lot more cost effectively. And to back that up, I took and did some research into places where they do have quote unquote socialized medicine, like Finland. Finland, the per capita cost of socialized medicine is $7,700 something per person. And I'm like, well, is there any place cheaper? And yeah, Sweden. Sweden was a little over $6,000 per person. I'm like, well, that's quite a bit cheaper than $10,000 per person. And if that's the case, those countries aren't that much bigger than Wyoming. And of course, there's always going to be the arguments. Well, what if somebody comes to Wyoming that's not a citizen of Wyoming? I'm like, treat them. We're not going to send them away, but they've probably got insurance, or maybe Wyoming can be a leader here and convince other states to get the same thing. We just bill their state. They present an ID from Colorado. We send the bill to the state of Colorado. I think there's this is probably not going to be very popular with the insurance companies, but I think for me, it makes sense to have control, to take control of our health insurance, or not health insurance, but our health care. Say we need a doctor in Lusk. We need a doctor in Lusk, but we can't find one that wants to move. Nobody wants to move to Lusk because there's just not enough people there. Well, this healthcare program that I'm talking about could set aside some money for training, and provide some scholarships to recruit doctors, and just say, we're going to pay for your medical school. You just give us 8 years. Give us the first 8 years after you finish your residency, and if you want to stay in Lusk, Wyoming, you stay there. Or if you want to go somewhere else, you go there.
A thought comes to my mind. Many in Wyoming might say that Wyoming has failed in programs that it's adopted and championed. So they might challenge your perspective on Wyoming leading healthcare internal as an agency of the state. But here's where I hear people going. Right now, going into February 9th, the 20-day budget session for the legislature in 2026, the biennial budget will come about, and already proposed are funding of the University of Wyoming and funding of the Wyoming Business Council. And where I hear people concerned about failure is, what has Wyoming done successfully from the legislature to provide jobs in Wyoming that allow and actually encourage and compete for keeping graduates right here in the state of Wyoming? I don't know how many Speaker of the House sessions that I've seen the first day of, and I've heard so importantly how we have to do this endeavor of keeping people in the state of Wyoming, yet our population is negligibly different than it was 20 years ago.
Really? Our number one export, you're talking about our number one export, our young people. And this is a topic that comes up in conversation almost every time I talk with a senator or a representative. And I'm like, what is going on? Why do we, drive to the, once our kids finish college or school, we drive to the edge of Wyoming and wave goodbye. Why is that? And are there any other opportunities besides oil field work and coal mining in Wyoming? We've got a business council that's going away. Good or bad, evidently didn't quite get the job done that we wanted. So, if that's the case,
it's being discussed that the Wyoming Business Council would go away, but it hasn't, to my knowledge, been
cut yet.
Completely, it's not a completely done deal.
Right.
Some say we had Ken Chestic, House District 13 representative for Albany County in Studio 255, maybe 4 weeks ago now, and Representative Chestic, his perspective was that we have a lot of potential in many ways, and he talked about not needing to cut anything in the university or the business council because we have the funds available to pay those particular deals. Now, Representative Chestic's in the Democratic Party, but it seems like you might agree with Representative Chestic in that regard. There is money to fund these, but should we?
Yeah, the question is what does Wyoming do well? Wyoming's a conservative state, and it manages its money well, very well. Last year, to my understanding, we profited $250 million above our expenses last year in Wyoming. So we got a little purse of money, and we'll probably invest that back into the mineral trust fund. I don't know exactly what the plan is for that, but the thing is that in our economy, and we have to set our priorities. And when I say we, I mean you and me. I mean the citizens of Wyoming. I mean that's what I talk about. When I talk about agency, I talk about the power of the regular person, voting citizen in Wyoming. To use the term they or them is not in the vocabulary of this campaign, because this campaign is about us, and it's about returning that agency back to us. And I plan to do that. But you mentioned, the 250 million that the state has could be used better to build some programs. I talked to an engineer in Grable, Wyoming, when I was down there, and he talked about the white sands outside of Tens Lake, Wyoming, where there's a big deposit of white sand there that's a prime resource that could be used in the manufacturing of glass. We've got trona mines in Green River area, so we could combine those two resources in a glass manufacturing and upgrade it to a chip manufacturing facility right here in Wyoming if we had the willpower to do so. But we also need the labor force to do that. Those are sparsely populated areas. Worland and Tens Lake there's not a whole lot of folks there. So we've got some infrastructure issues that we need to solve if we're gonna retain that youth in Wyoming. And
when you talk about not a lot of resource in terms of labor, mostly population in each of our communities across 23 counties in Wyoming, what do you propose doing from the federal level as a potential U.S. Senator for Wyoming to support that infrastructure growing and developing in a positive way, far beyond the 2% change that I understand we've seen in Laramie, Wyoming, and in population over several years?
Yeah, from a federal standpoint, it's my focus is on bringing us back to the center. As the political wind blows, and so blows some of our senators and representatives in Wyoming. And I think we've blown a little bit too far off center. So we need to come back to the center. The center is where we find the common ground. The center is where we talk to each other. The center is where the conversation shifts back to what the priorities for folks in Wyoming are. How do we leverage the power of the federal government? We utilize that by working together, not by fighting with one another. You don't go and poke your neighbor in the eye when he's repairing his fence. You go out and stop the truck and give him a hand stretching the wire while he's putting that back up. That's just Wyoming's way. I don't see where we got off that track, and so that's another reason I got off the couch is like, why are we fighting with each other? Let's get back to talking with each other. Let's get back to solving the problems that face everyone, not just here in Wyoming. And you mentioned something earlier that kind of spurred a thought, and we've got to do more. We've got to look out for our neighbors, and we've got to call a ball when we see a ball and a strike when we see a strike. And I'm calling a strike on federal overreach. When we got a government that's sending the National Guard, sending my children, sending your children into the streets in American cities, we got to put a halt to that. I wrote a letter to Senator Loomis, Brassel, and Representative Hageman. I said, when there's blood from these actions, that blood's on your hands, because there's three branches to our government. There's a judicial, a legislative, and there's an executive, and each of those plays a check on the other. And if one of them starts to gain too much of an upper hand, the other two step in to check the third branch. And that's not happening right now. We've got some serious federal overreach going on in our country, and we have some senators that are sitting back and watching the show, eating the popcorn, flashing their mirrors and blowing the smoke, and that upsets me.
It's an interesting soundbite to talk about government overreach and the size of government overall. When you come down to the specific topic of immigration, and border control. Where does Jimmy Skovgard stand on controlling our borders?
I watched Joe Biden's administration allow the borders to stay open, and I just kept thinking to myself, why? Why are we not closing that border? And maybe he was, but I never heard it get talked about. But as soon as President Trump stepped in, he closed the border, mobilized the National Guard, did what he had to do to stop that flow of immigration. And if that was an issue that's facing us, then that was a good job. And as far as the folks that are here already, though, how we deal with them, I have a totally different plan on that, Eric. The plan that I have it mirrors the plan that President Ronald Reagan did in 1986. The foundation, that was the foundation of the Immigration Control and Reform Act in 1986. In that plan, President Reagan ran on the platform that he felt that the folks that had been here, had been part of our communities, were not entitled, but they should have a process for amnesty. And so he worked with Congress to come up with this plan that granted amnesty to 2.7 million undocumented workers that had been contributing to the system for years in the United States. And it put the whole issue behind the country, and we were able to move on, and he was able to reduce the high interest rates that were prevalent at that time and improve the economy. Granted, he was one of the first ones that started running the deficit up, but that's the job of the government, it looks like, running the deficit up. Now let's get back to immigration, because that is one of the reasons why I got off the couch. Immigrants, undocumented or not, typically have very little say. They're a voice without representation, so they're an easy target, and they're a target that's currently being used, in my mind, and I don't think this is a stretch in any means, but they're an issue that's being used by politicians to divide the country. And I have to ask, why are we being divided, neighbor against neighbor, state against state? Why are we being divided as a country? And
some would interject right there. Some citizens in the United States of America would interject. The immigrant divided our country by coming in lawfully or unlawfully. There's a difference to many citizens in the United States on how people entered, the right way or the wrong way. What do you say with respect to legal or illegal entry to our country and how we deal with them? Does an illegal entrant to our country maintain the right of all of our laws? Should they have those rights within the United States?
No, if you've come here in violation, that was what the IRCA did. It established the rules for immigration into the U.S. It also established penalties for employers that employed folks that entered into the country illegally. And, I'm just a guy that sits on the couch most of the time, or was, and I watch CSI and things like that. And whenever we wanted to solve a crime that we had a problem with, we went after the money. And in my watching of how this is unfolded, how we're attacking this immigration problem right now is unfolded. I haven't seen one employer perp walked. Maybe we picked up a couple of them, but there are penalties in the IRCA for employing undocumented workers. I think that to control immigration, you control the border, like President Trump did, and then you control the money. You go after the money. Going after the guy that's here to feed his family, he may not even know that he's breaking the law. He's just here to feed his family. And we're going to educate him when we pick him up and say you can't do that. But we have an opportunity right now to offer that man amnesty, and then after we take care of his issue, we don't have to go out and bust down doors in Minneapolis or deploy the National Guard and Marines to Los Angeles or whatever we're doing. We don't have to do that anymore if we just offer amnesty, forgiveness. We can do that. And we have to acknowledge the fact that they didn't come here legally, and that's not fair to everybody that they didn't come here illegally, but we're bigger than that. Some of us, and I think a lot of us, when it gets right down to it, we're just bigger than that, and we can offer forgiveness. I think this takes me back to Sunday school again. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. that was a foundational thing that was taught to me when I was 7 or 8 years old.
When people talk about immigration and border control over the last 10 years, many will take the conversation to election integrity. Currently in the state of Wyoming, Secretary of State Chuck Gray has championed several initiatives that take voting away from ballot boxes and what have you in terms of our elections. Where do you stand with respect to illegal immigrants voting in our elections in each of the 50 states?
Well, I'm here speaking for Wyoming, and I've watched the election in Wyoming. I've watched the process that established Real ID. I went and got my ID after we did Real ID, and yeah, I had to go and get a certified copy of my birth certificate from my birthplace in Spearfish, South Dakota, and I had to present that at the DMV there in Casper to get my driver's license, or yet to get my new Real ID. And so I have complete faith in Wyoming's election cycle. And so this is another issue for me. I'm saying, this is another smoke and mirror issue for me. And Chuck Gray, I'm glad you brought that guy up. I recently saw that he's down there supporting the States Act. And the States Act, I'm glad that Senator Barrasso and Senator Loomis are opposed to this, because this is clearly federal overreach into a state power. The states regulate the right or the voting in the United States. That's a power of each state. And for us to go in there and say we need federal overreach into our election system is ludicrous to me, ridiculous. And we've got a Secretary of State in there supporting this. Not only that, he hand delivered our list of voters, our voter registration list that contain personally identifying information of every Wyoming voter that registered in the 2024 election. Every one of them was handed to the federal government.
What kind of personal information are you talking about, Jimmy?
Your name, your address,
phone number.
Sometimes the list I got didn't have phone numbers. I had to purchase those, but that's available.
It's available if you pay for it, huh?
Yeah, you pay it. Yeah, I paid $1,000, and I got 113,000 phone numbers for the voters in Wyoming. I'm like, so it's not much. And I suppose, that said, I'm suppose the federal government didn't need to request the list from Chuck Gray and make it a political issue, but they did, and so now Chuck's going to answer for it. At least to me, he's going to answer for it. You don't go and hand out information about folks without their permission. And that's what Chuck did. You could go write a request to Chuck for the voter file for Wyoming, and he'll tell you, no, I can't do that. I'm prevented from sending that to you because you're not a political candidate. That's reserved for political candidates in the Wyoming races. And I say, Chuck, what candidate is the federal government? What office in Wyoming is the federal government running for? None. What authority under the Wyoming Constitution do you have to deliver that information to the federal government, and participate in this federal overreach? This I don't know. I feel a little bit sick just thinking about it.
Beyond healthcare and topics of the universe, in Laramie, Wyoming, so many people want to know: do you support $40 million in cuts to the University of Wyoming?
Eric, I'm going to say that's a big no. I came to the University of Wyoming. I've only, I haven't seen any waste, fraud, or abuse. I haven't heard of any waste, fraud, or abuse. And maybe I'm not paying it close enough attention. Maybe there's some folks here that could tell me, set me straight, and I'd certainly like to talk to them if there are. But to cut $40 million out of an institution like the University of Wyoming means to cut 160 or more jobs of hardworking families right here in Laramie. And are we looking at the human side of what that does? And we have a surplus, the state surplus of $250 million, and then you justify how are you justifying the cut? What's driving the cut? Is there an austerity measure that we're coming up? Are we looking at some kind of funding shortfall? What's going on? We had over $1 billion returned on our investment funds in Wyoming last year. Wyoming has the money. Why are we cutting it? So that it loses value when the dollar declines?
Isn't it healthy to check yourself in government spending, allocation, resource dedication? Isn't it good to ask yourself, should the government be competing with the private sector?
The government shouldn't compete with the private sector, but if the private sector fails, then the government needs to step in. And I'm referring back to healthcare again. But back to your question about economy, the reason why the government needs to keep the university fully funded is because we have that little border issue that I was talking about earlier, when your son graduates from the college and your child graduates from high school. And
and you say that people wave.
Yeah, you drive them to the border and you wave as they leave.
And they never come back, right?
Yeah, and so if we cut funding to institutions like the University of Wyoming, and we cut jobs to the University of Wyoming, and we cut the Business Council like we were talking about earlier, and we cut this and we cut that, and we adopt this policy of austerity, how do we keep those? How do we build the future for our children? This is a responsibility not for just our folks. We can't use that they. This has got to be a responsibility of us, and so we have the responsibility. And one of my platforms, Eric, is technology. I want to bridge the technology gap between the electorate and their representatives. To start off with, I'm going to use surveys, and right now I've built a platform, and it's in a kind of a test phase, and it's out there in the public. If you'd like to try the surveys, I've only got two of them. I got a survey on abortion, I got a survey on public school funding, because that's coming up in front of the legislature this year, and so I wanted to see how it works. So it's at grassrootsmvt.org. So you go to grassrootsmvt.org. And it's going to ask you to log in. I suggest you log in with your cell phone at the place where you say you reside in your voter registration file. Because what I do in that program is I go to the voter registration file that Chuck provided me. Thank you, Chuck. And I check your address with what you say your address is. And then your phone it'll ask you to send your location, and it uploads your location, and then it downloads and it verifies you as saying, oh yeah, you are at that location. That's today's technology. And I'm like, the reason why we're not using that is because we don't have the will. And one of my campaign slogans is, in Wyoming, if it's broken, well, we fix it. And if we need a tool, well, we build it. Back in the day, when my grandfather homesteaded in 1909 here, we didn't have a Home Depot and a Menards right around the corner or within a day's drive. You needed something, you built it. You needed to get something done, you did it yourself. Maybe you needed a little help, you maybe talked to your neighbor and got some help, but that was about it. We're kind of a conservative, self-reliant state, and I like that.
You were in Laramie, Wyoming yesterday, visiting with members of the community. What topics were key concerns for each of them, Jimmy?
The key things keep reoccurring. There's the topic of immigration. There's the topic of the economy. There's the topic of jobs and retaining employees, and of course the school funding and abortion, and there are some hot button topics. I call them hot button topics, and they're hot button. Let me tell you, you can get on one side. I was on Facebook, Eric. For example, I'm on Facebook, and I'm talking with a lady. She's using a nom de plume, and like on Facebook, and she actually sent me an email. It's like her name she used was Alta Garcia, and this was a pen name, and she later reveals this to me as the conversation progresses. And we're talking about abortion, and then on the other hand, there's a gentleman named Bob who's on my Facebook Messenger, and he's talking about abortion, and she's pro-choice and he's pro-life, and they're both saying the same thing. They're both saying, how can you represent me if you won't pick a side? And Bob's the same thing. How can you represent pro-life if you won't pick a side? And so I'm arguing to both of them. As your representative, it's my job to not just represent you, but to represent everyone in the pro-choice camp, and you put your other foot in the pro-life camp, and you listen to the arguments from both of those camps, and you allow those camps to have a debate and come up, and somewhere in the middle, this is the goal. Somewhere in the middle of these far extremes, you find the solution. And that's what happens when we work together. And so the idea behind the survey is to aggregate the voices of those communities, show those folks in that community, because the results are dynamic. You can change however you want. When you want to change your results, if you want to verify your results, you go back to that survey, open it up, it shows you exactly what your choices are. And you're like, oh, I just talked to Eric today on the radio, and he convinced me to move my choice down, so I'm going to do that. And then you go back and look at the results of the survey, and you see that maybe you need to go out in the community because your position is underwater. And you need to go and convince your neighbor and convince your friends to get on this survey and communicate their desires to their representatives. And these, because I have the state voter file, and the state voter file does include your Senate district and your House district, and we can also find that through what's called geolocating with your address. But anyway, with that said, you have the ability to aggregate these voices based upon their House district and their Senate district, so that representative, your representative, can go to that tool that's being developed, but it's going to be I think it's going to be a good, useful tool for folks, and see how the people in their district feel about that issue. And the issue of abortion is very hot button right now.
Obviously, a respondent to a survey has submitted and agreed to give you that data. What would you do in today's world to protect their answers that they shared with you in confidence?
Their information, I don't even, when I collect the answers, I collect an email, but I have I don't have their email, so I could get the email because that's available for a fee too, but it's like, a couple $1,000s for the same number as phone numbers, and it's not as protected as phone numbers, which is strange. I mean, we could associate that, but I don't. I choose not to record your name, and I choose not to record your
voter X, House district, Senate district, that kind of deal, but the rest is unknown.
It's like my record would be Skovgard2026.org, or no, at gmail.com. I'm sorry, I just used the free Gmail for my. It would be, my responses are recorded under Skovgard2026.org or at gmail.com, and so that's how I keep track of it. So if I need to verify a response, if I find something that looks a little fishy, I can send an email out to that and say, hey, give me a call back. I want to verify your responses. Or you can actually email me at that same email that I just said. If you suppose you have trouble logging into my system, send me an email. I'll verify you. If you're a verified voter, I'll find a way to verify you, and then set your record to verified so that you are heard in that survey.
If you were to identify one individual in Wyoming politics who represented the state of Wyoming at any level, local, federal, state, you name it, who might that individual be who most closely you identify with as a statesman or representative of Wyoming?
When I was growing up, we had, and in college, we had Al Simpson. And, Al Simpson talked about integrity, and he had a little saying about integrity, integrity, if you have it, it doesn't matter. If you don't have it, it doesn't matter. And, you kind of think about that for a second, and you say, oh, yeah, I see what he's saying. And his statement is so true, and it's so true today. Without integrity, we lose things like transparency. Without integrity, we lose things like accountability. And so how do we restore those things? And, the idea behind the building a tech tool, like a tool like I was talking about, we can link your representative to your survey. I got this idea from Julie Jarvis. She represents a House district in Casper, and we had a conversation. We started talking about tools and tech tools, and she says, look at what I did in 2024, and she showed me her survey. She had sent 22 surveys to her constituency of about 3,000 people, inviting them to respond, and telling them that if they responded, that was the way she was going to vote. She was going to find the bill, and she would match it up to whatever their responses were in that survey. She had about 20% of her constituency, about 600 people, I think, responded back to her surveys, and she showed me how she voted on each bill at the end of the day, she had every bill listed with each survey that she thought, and she showed her constituency whether she voted yes or voted no for that. And I found that to be intriguing. And I thought, why can't we do that right now? Why can't we do that in a secure fashion? And so I've done what I can to secure it. You talked about security and digital security, and can you trust the digital stuff? Well, there's platforms out there like I had an interaction with Pamela. Pamela is living in France right now, and she's a Wyoming resident. And she travels back and forth. They have an estate in France and one here in Wyoming. And she contacted me, and she wanted to try the survey out. And I said, well, what an opportunity, because I blocked foreign IPs from my survey. And the site itself, the server blocks these IPs, so she couldn't access the survey. So I had to come up with a workaround where I verified her before her email address would bypass all those security features that I've implemented. So we have bot limitations, so you can't get bot spammed. I can't get, if you have to verify that you're a human. You have to verify your email address so that the email that you're using is you. And we have one of the best security professionals in the country living right here in Laramie. Do you know who that is?
Tell me.
That's Brett Glass. He comes in here every Monday and does a radio show for you, and I wanted to give him a shout out because Brett's a good friend of mine.
Lariat.net. We appreciate the support of that internet service provider all over the talk shop, and we thank that supplier, Brett Glass. We appreciate you. When you talk with Brett Glass, what are some of the topics perhaps that are most intriguing to you as you visit with Brett Glass?
Well, there's no way I could have developed this system that I have on the website without AI. And Brett and I had a kind of a conversation about the risks of using AI, and there are risks of using AI. And in education, I had the same conversation with Jack Daniels. I did a podcast with Jack Daniels that's up on my website at Skovgard2026.org.
Old number 7.
Yeah, and Jack Daniels, a history teacher, and that I'll never forget the name of. I struggle with names. I told Eric earlier I struggle with names, but I won't be struggling with that one. Jack, he says, I was like, why don't you integrating AI in? And he's like, well, it does something for kids, and this was reinforced by my son last night. I was talking to him. I'm like, why don't you integrate and use AI more often in your job? And he's like, well, it stops you from thinking. He says it does all the thinking for you. And I've used AI, to help me write over the past year, and I found some truth to that. When I get tired and when I don't pay attention, the AI kind of just randomly throws thoughts together, and you're like, oh, that sounds good, but that's not right. AI is an enhancement tool. It's like the computer, the word processors that we started out with in the 80s. Those were cool. It was a daisy wheel printer spinning around, making all kinds of noise. And it developed into what we use today, the laser printer that spits out page after page after page. But these tools are tools, and they're meant for us to learn how to use them and then to use them effectively. And so to be afraid of a tool, that's not right.
Later this morning, I will head to Cheyenne, and the topic in Cheyenne will be wind power. As a U.S. Senator for Wyoming, do you agree with subsidizing each turbine? Do you agree with federal subsidies there?
You know what, Eric, I would agree with the subsidies if my electric bill went down. But you know what I've seen? I've seen my electric bill go up. And actually, this last year, I think my electric bill went up about 30%, and that's ridiculous. So, before I could, subsidize any energy program, I would want to see that energy program was going to bring my bill down. Show me industry or whoever you are. I think Warren Buffett owns Pacific Core. I'd be like, hey, Warren, or whoever is speaking for Warren now, if he's too old, come here and show me how subsidizing wind power is going to lower my electric bill. And that leads into the next question. The big concern on my mind right now is we're looking at establishing some data centers here in Wyoming. We're actually doing it. And we're going to consume 2 6.7 times the entire energy consumption of the state in one data center. And I'm like, how is that not going to affect my energy cost? You know, and I'm looking at my legislatures and I'm asking them one at a time, what are you doing? What are you doing to protect the cost of my energy? And not only that, you know, I don't want to run out of gas in the winter. You better ensure that I have gas before, you know, somebody's data center has gas, because if you don't, there's going to be hell to pay.
Why do we not plan forward with respect to the creation and the development of these data centers, solar farms, what have you? Why do we not require, why is the government not protecting the citizens of Wyoming with respect to make the developer responsible for the power, the water, make that business plan comprehensive and make it viable without the subsidy? Why do we not put that down?
You know, and I talked to Senator Landon and Representative Riggins about this quite a bit, and I think there is some discussion about that, but it's not concrete.
It comes too late.
Yeah,
it comes too late. We have 4,000 wind turbines permitted from Colorado border, Wyoming, to the South Dakota, Montana. It's referred to by one Cheyenne resident as the wind wall.
Yeah.
And it doesn't operate efficiently enough to provide power 24/7.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to transparency and accountability. You know, there's no way for us well, there is a way. We can send an email. Have you ever sent an email to your representative or your senator, or even say to Harriet? And, you know, actually I have. I've sent some emails and I got some responses back. I got good responses back from Senator Loomis. Thank you, Senator Loomis. And I got some decent responses back from Representative Hageman. And I thank her for that, because the ones I get back from John Barrasso appear to be canned or written by interns, or if that's the way John Barrasso writes, that's pretty pathetic. But anyway, to answer your question more currently, when you send an email in, your voice doesn't aggregate with the community. Maybe the senators are aggregating these in some kind of, you know, archaic method. They have file system in their office, and they can put all the in, they count all the responses up, or however they do it, or they have interns do it. But I'm like, I want the feedback right there in front of me. When I respond, you know, if my concerns aren't listed on my website, and I only have 2 surveys up right now because I'm just kind of running a little slow on time, but I'll get more up. You know, the economy's going to go up. We're going to talk about healthcare in those surveys also. I'm going to collect your responses. Granted, my surveys are going to be designed as peacekeeper surveys, and when I say peacekeeper surveys, I'm going to try my hardest not to be biased, not to show any bias on one side or the other. Like on my abortion survey, if you take that survey, if you log into grassrootsmbt.org and take that survey, you should notice that it is a neutral survey. And it encompasses, you know, you might want more. You might want to put more information in, depending on how you feel. But that's, you know, and I've got a box down at the bottom where you can enter your feelings on it. I think I limited it to 800 characters, so you can't write me a real big essay, but you can certainly send me an email.
Taxes are a going concern for Americans, and regardless of what state people live in, the previous 12 months has exposed spending billions of dollars overseas, and it's become more difficult for many citizens in the United States to tolerate our rising tax bill, faced with billions of dollars being spent overseas in ways that we feel we've lost control. And Wyoming doesn't have but a few representatives, given our population. We don't have that say. Do you support those people who say, I don't want property tax, I don't want income tax? Can you, at the federal level, do anything policy-wise to support that or justify it as a candidate?
The tax situation, that's going to be, to me, spending is linked not to simply taxes. It's linked to our unwilling our representatives' unwillingness. Maybe it's because it is our. I think when we look at if we try to foist the blame off onto our representatives, we're foisting the blame off onto ourselves, because we're the ones that put those folks there to represent us. And so my position on that is, if we have an issue with taxes, then we need to say something about it. We need to have a way to, again, the technology tool that I'm proposing gives us an opportunity to weigh in on these issues. But when we talk about taxes and reduction of taxes or refund of taxes, and then we say, how are we paying for that? And there's the elephant in the room right there, Eric. The elephant in the room is, how are we paying for what we're consuming right now? And that's through the credit card, the big $38 trillion credit card that's sitting there facing us. And so if we have a $38 trillion debt that our representatives, our senators, are unwilling to talk about, that is in direct conflict with the Wyoming values. Our conservative Wyoming values say, no, we put money away for a rainy day. No, we don't outspend the resources that we have, and we try to set the example for our neighbors, our neighboring states who maybe are following the path of the federal government and spending more money than they have. Mm-hmm. And that's leading to a situation where we're going to see, odd solutions being tried. And when I say an odd solution, the current solution right now is the devaluation of the U.S. dollar against other currencies so that we can pay back our debt with a dollar that's worth less than it is today. But what does that mean for you and me, Eric? When you go to replace that or upgrade that road system or that podcasting system, that recording system, what does that mean to you if the dollar today buys less tomorrow? What does that mean? More of those dollars. You're going to spend more of those dollars to get what you want done that you get done today. For example, conversation I had with Senator Landon. State Senator Landon is a representative. My representative is in my district is Bob Ide. I've tried to get a hold of him. I've tracked him down several times. He just seems too busy to talk to me, and I find that strange. And so I'm calling him out a little bit here. Sorry, Bob, but when somebody asks you for a meeting that you represent, and you ought to at least get back to them and tell them when that can happen. So back to the issue at hand, we're looking at some, I'm sorry.
The talk shop is going on 9 years young this year. You mentioned candidate and representative accountability through the availability to respond. You obviously believe that citizens deserve response to their inquiry, and you've talked about a survey system where you might represent everybody's interest, perhaps by data-driven decision making, more than individual perspective or vantage points, topic by topic. Is that correct?
Yeah. Why would we do something like that? Why would I reach out to the people that have the agency to hire and fire me as a representative or a senator? Why would I care to build my conversation around the folks that I represent? Why? Because I think we have an infiltration of some big money interests into politics. Another reason I got off the couch. If you have the ability to influence an election with money, which there's no denying that, and the psychology behind it, I looked into that. I'm like, what is the psychology behind a lie? Why can we tell a lie and tell a lie, and we do it? I find that psychologists say if you hear it 7 times, all of a sudden it kind of takes residence in your mind. And it doesn't have to be a lie. It could just be a regular truth too. But the truth should already be there in your mind. But a lie, it takes at least 7 times. Somebody telling you 7 times. Okay, so if you have enough money and you can buy some advertising on Eric's radio show, and you can tell folks a lie 7 times and get Eric to tell them maybe 7 more times, then maybe that takes hold, and then folks start talking about that lie, and it becomes okay. The truth no longer matters. The psychology of this is called mass psychology, and it was first played around with in the early 20s. There was a campaign to get women to start smoking cigarettes. Women didn't smoke cigarettes, and so there was a campaign. They put out some models, some nice looking ladies in the Macy's Day Parade in New York with cigarettes. They're smoking cigarettes, and pretty soon, other ladies started smoking cigarettes, and pretty soon more ladies started smoking cigarettes, and pretty soon you could see folks catching on to the trend. This is how, the psychology, it's not necessarily good for you to smoke cigarettes, but folks didn't know that in the 20s. And hey, this is okay. Women didn't smoke cigarettes, and all of a sudden they did.
In 2020, we had a mask mandate sweep the nation. COVID-19 strikes the United States. I remember Rodeo Houston, March 15th, shuts down. Never before happened. Never before had I seen this happen in the country. But mask mandates kind of became familiar with other mandates. Like, if we're really after the safety of our citizens, why have we allowed tobacco sales to continue throughout history? Why is the cigarette promotes nobody's health? I don't think that's a foreign concept. Why do we tolerate it? Why are we complacent? And why do we permit that devastation through lung cancer and others, the addiction of nicotine? Why do we allow that?
I like to say in Wyoming, we're kind of a conservative state, and if it doesn't really impact me that you're over there smoking a cigarette, then really, is it any of my business? Yeah, I recognize, and you probably recognize at this point in time, you probably recognize that is damaging to your health, and yet you continue to do it. That's it kind of a personal choice. But yeah, when it becomes not a personal choice is when we ask the government to step in and pay the cost of and there was some lawsuits about this, and the tobacco industry was able to settle it and move on money wise, but we still have cigarettes, don't we? We have new things. We have new technology, vape and things like that. These things are addictive chemicals, and that would be something that I could get behind RFK on. I don't get behind RFK and his vaccine nonsense. And I was pretty proud of our Senator Barrasso standing up to RFK there and calling him out on the carpet on that. I think he should do more, but yeah.
So with respect to vaccines, is that a choice? Do you advocate for the citizens' choice, or do you advocate to the mandate, which is more closely aligned with your candidacy?
Yeah, I don't think you can mandate a vaccine, and here's the reason why. In Wyoming, we have, under Article 1, Section 38, we have the right. We passed in 2012. We passed an amendment that said that we have the right to make our own healthcare choices in Wyoming. And currently, that's the ruling that kind of stepped in on the abortion issue, of why the Supreme Court rejected the abortion laws that were forwarded through the legislature last year. Anyway, or the year before. I'm not sure when they were forwarded. I'd have to check my notes and get back to you on that. But anyway, as far as vaccines go, yeah, you absolutely in Wyoming you absolutely have the right to take or not to take a vaccine.
That wasn't exactly the case as we experienced in the last 5 years, as folks lost their jobs.
That's true.
With that position.
That is an unfortunate thing. If you were a healthcare provider, you could lose your job. Mm-hmm. If you were a government employee, you could lose your job. And so that was a bit of federal overreach into some states' business there, wasn't it? And so
now, if they were federal jobs,
they were fired if they were federal jobs. Yeah.
They lost their military career. They lost their they lost their livelihood.
Yeah, so you have a little separation between state and federal. In Wyoming, we choose to take our personal freedoms a little more carefully, guard them a little more carefully. And when we talk about federal overreach into states' business, I'm talking, all the way down to my snowmobile trail. My sister likes to drive snowmobiles, and she tells me, she goes, I just hate it when the Department of the Interior tells me I can't go on my favorite snowmobile trail. And did they check with the community before they shut that trail down? Did they check to see what type of economic damage that would do to tourism in that area? No, they did not.
We're visiting with Jimmy Skovgard, U.S. Senate candidate in 2026 as part of the Candidate Awareness Tour 2026 right here on the Talk Shop. We'll be back in a moment for final segment with Jimmy Skovgard.